I also will be talking today about a podcast that I produce and host called The J Word, which is connected to journalism practice, an academic journal that has an aim of really trying to theorize practice, but also try and influence positively journalistic practices to be more inclusive, to be more diverse, to struggle with issues of ethics. And so this podcast is something that I'm going to talk about as a potential tool. I'm also an associate editor at Journalism Practice, and it was the first journal I ever published in as an academic. So everything kind of comes full circle, and I'm very excited about what we're doing there. So today's talk begins with a premise that Western journalism and research of journalism has many problems. And the reason why I'm focusing on Western journalism is because within journalistic research and within a lot of industry, including technological development, there is a continued focus on the aims of Westernization, the aims of democratization, notions of civicness that appear within Western and usually US and UK perspectives, not just on how journalism should operate in terms of its ethics, its standards, what's good and what's bad journalism, but in terms of the focus and aims of what journalism should do. And oftentimes that ignores journalistic practices, perspectives from much of the rest of the globe. Still, it is a dominant perspective that continues to be pushed by governments, corporations, and journalism institutions themselves. And so while there is this talk is really focused on those problems of a Western type of journalistic practice, I think it's still important to unpack that, because if those are pressures that continually are used to balance or to measure another society's journalism against, it's important to understand where that benchmark that's being maybe forced upon different societies is rooted and what the problems are within this kind of system. So right now, this Western journalism has been undergoing for quite a while, some may say decades, but more recently, I think we've seen it in mis and disinformation concerns. It's been dealing with authority and legitimacy positions, right? Also, you could say relevancy, right? So when you have humor journalism coming through, satire journalism, you have social media and people spreading their opinions and beliefs and facts across that sort of ecosystem. Journalism has to find a way to revive itself, it has to find a way to say, we're still relevant, we still are the authorities on giving you, the audiences, fair and balanced, transparent, some might say objective perspectives on the world. And that's really been thrown into a flux, into a lot of unbalance. And so journalism seeking a revival, and it's constantly seeking a revival. It's paradigm maintenance, if you will. But this most recent one coming out of Donald Trump's reign as president, maybe he'll be back as president again, we don't know. And widespread populism of all sorts across the globe, journalism is seeking to position itself as being the authority on information today. This technological advancement that we're seeing in terms of the virtual reality, podcasting, 360 sound, other types of technologies that journalism is trying to maintain its relevancy and its authority and legitimacy through, such as push notifications, how journalists appear on watches. Ray-Ban now has new glasses where people can interact with. They're like the Google Glass of today, but they look a little bit nicer. They can interact with their social media feeds and take images, photos and whatnot from their glasses. Journalism has to think about how do we fit into that. But the constant conversations about what is new technology and how journalism can use it often distracts us from issues of problems of the inequalities, race-based inequalities, class-based inequalities, geographic ones, as I've talked about. And so that's one of the problems that we're facing in Western journalism. But there are these other ones, these long-standing issues of ideology. And I use Thompson's definition of ideology, meaning in the service of power, where our explanations for everyday events, political strife and unrest, police behaviors, corporate behaviors, new fashion designs, entertainment, why things are explained and how they're explained in popular culture, in media systems, and in journalism rely upon dominant ideologies, more than just belief systems, but structures of power that where the explanations are to reinforce dominant positions and understandings. So, we can look at different things like Black Panther and other Marvel films. The reason why superheroes do so well is because they elevate positions of authority, right? They work alongside militaries. They work alongside corporations. And very rarely do the superheroes in Marvel question the powers that be, right? And so that makes sense. That resonates and is salient with its audiences. And that's an example of an ideology and how it works, its hegemonic function. And so this has been an issue in journalism, how and who explains the causes of a wildfire, for instance. Is that climate change? Does climate change have anything to do with it? If a person lit a match and started a fire in Australia or anywhere else? So journalism is constantly critiqued, as it should be, I think, by a very select few, by very few people about its ideological problems. Some examples here are a social media campaign that went around communication so white. Again, this is a Western perspective. We could call it communication so Western, right? Communication so male, communication so straight, cisgender, for instance. We could pick different ways, but there is a critique that has been emerging over the last few years about communication's whiteness problems, not just whiteness in terms of skin color alone, but in skin tone, in class or caste-based situations, in geographies. So there are some elements where people are talking about why so many white men, myself, right, straight white men, are in positions of power in journalism and in journalism studies. And those are conversations that should be had about every facet of our society and what those people are doing with their power and how can they make things more inclusive. So there have been some approaches, a reciprocity, a sharing, or a reciprocal relationship where I, as the journalist, work with you, a citizen, and we create content together about your neighborhood. We may call that reciprocity. There have been conversations about reflexivity, where we think about our role as journalists and how we're interpreting data journalism, for instance. And we know that algorithms tend to be race-based in terms of the human involvement in creating the content. They're binary-based, as though there's a good and a bad, a 1 or a 0, a black or a white, right? An up or a down. So it reinforces kind of that polarization that is amplified through algorithms and communication surrounding them. And a constant conversation about relationships. How do we engage with citizens, users, audiences in ways that move our brand, right? Sell our product, but also show that we are caring as journalists for our societies. Each of these have problems, right? So in reciprocity, I wrote a paper with some colleagues where we kind of showed, is this really what we think it is? Is it possible for journalism to be reciprocal? What is it that audiences and citizens want and need from journalism that it may or may not be able to give? Is it different sources, different types of people working there, different stories, the ability of citizens to actually edit the content and control what the final product looks like? And to what degree are journalists willing to give up that power and control or to share it? Same with reflexivity. That's a very complicated notion of how do we reflect upon who we are, the intersectionalities, the inequalities, and how does that feel? Because when we do reflexivity, we should be giving up some of our power and control, right? We should be leveling ourselves out a little bit. We should be expressing and expanding notions of shared uh, abilities. Now, this conversation isn't very interactive in that sense, right? It's still very, I'm talking to you, you're listening to me. So that's a really hard thing to accomplish, but it's something worth looking at. And I think relationships are problematic in terms of how do you really have shared power. But there's this concept that Callison and Young have helped us kind of explore a little bit more, the notion of reckoning. And they define this as a coming to terms with unfinished business, a settling of scores and or past mistakes. And they walk through kind of ways that this can happen, right? It can be purposefully, right, and meaningfully including women in data journalism, in immersive communication models, in business decisions, in politics, right? It could be physically having a more diverse group of people at a table operating together in meaningful ways where there's consent, there's respect, right? But it also has to do with some of the narratives of how we change the stories that we tell and acknowledging the moments when we got it wrong while we got it right. In other words, if we're telling stories about social movement, right, oftentimes journalists tell stories of social movements still through a power dynamic from a top-down position of how authorities are responding and trying to explain their rationales for social behavior or notions of social control through the lens of the people on the ground who are fighting against it, instead of kind of taking a position, because journalism doesn't want to be seen as advocating, right? And journalism also doesn't want to lose its authority and relevancy with the powers that be. But this reckoning kind of would force us into a different style of journalism, perhaps, where we are more transparent. We are very clear about our subjectivities of who we have working on different stories, how and why we've made certain decisions, and reflecting upon what we've done in the past that have contributed to publics going out and voting, perhaps, for policies that might not have been very inclusive, that journalists and journalisms have reinforced. So we can get into some of those details later, but the reckoning notion is more than just the doing of journalism, but it starts with a thinking about journalism. And I think, the global journalism itself, as I've described, is under the fist of westernized notions of journalism, and yet we talk about that, and this is one of the things that Callison and Young say. We've talked about this for a long time. We've known these things. We've known about who runs newsrooms. We know about how scholarship operates, but we're still reproducing the same racisms, and we're reproducing the same geographic biases, so on and so forth. And at some point, we have to stop and say, why are we doing that? And how do we stop doing that? So this is a multi-layered conversation. And one of the things is, how do we hear voices and hold others to account? And I was wondering, could podcasting be one of those methods? So we know that podcasting, particularly in journalism, is a good place for true crime, right? For us to hear stories of different geographies and different events. There's an intimacy in its form where you're hearing the ambient sound, you're interacting, you're having a physical and even a chemical reaction to how you hear certain sounds, and you hear people's voices that maybe you wouldn't hear otherwise. And I can share this PowerPoint later because there's a lot on here if you'd like, but there are several of these podcasts that talk about media from a bit of a critical perspective, put it into some context. Buzz Machine, El Cafe, Latinx, Journalism History, and Deutschblog. So these are things I can share with you. Again, these are very Western, right? And I selected these in particular because I'm trying to look at what are some of the podcasts within that culture, within that society, and these are ones that we know have popped out. We've talked generally in scholarship and in industry about podcasting as a power tool, right? Where there are discussions about collaboration. Is podcasting an easier or a better venue for that type of reciprocal relationship, perhaps, where people can do some of the editing themselves, they can share their voices, they can make some decisions. Is it a little bit more fluid in that sense to explain everyday life? But yet there are still some challenges to address. There's a lot of topics that people find divisive that podcasting has really provided a platform for. I don't know if that's a problem or if that's something to be celebrated, that podcasting is an area where people from different political, faith-based, gendered perspectives, so on and so forth, can come in and have discussion. But some people think that maybe that's amplifying some dangerous speech. I'll leave that to you. But I think it's that balance between freedom to express and some people's concerns about echo chambers and amplification of hate speech, so on and so forth. And Cook, for instance, writes something interesting in the anthropological sense of using podcasts to do research and to talk about research. There still is some sort of godlike presence of the voice, the narrator, or the voices themselves speaking into your ear, communicating a dominant sort of interpretation, once again, of meanings. So it's a debate, a discussion to be had. But my question still remains, and we'll get to it now, of what about the form and the format of podcasting can we use, right? Can we manipulate to have I don't want to say positive, but a meaningful impact in discussion, particularly about the problems of journalism? Is there something about the technologies? Is this more accessible? If there's not a paywall, for instance, if you don't need to have a huge broadband connection, if you can download something and listen to it later, if you don't have to have the newest device or a headset, is there something about the equity or the accessibility to these technologies and the techniques? Are they familiar, right? Are we not asking people to move into a different sort of environment, virtual reality or immersion, where they're used to hearing radio, they're used to hearing music, they're used to hearing things through the same device? Is there something there where this could move us into a more equitable and equal playing field for communication? And then, of course, the voices and vantage points. Could this simply be another platform to expand upon those things? So I had a COVID effect in the sense of I was isolated, sheltered for, or shielded, I guess they call it, for 3 or 4 months. At the beginning of COVID, luckily, we didn't experience the actual illness that, as far as we're aware, we haven't. And in the summer of 2020, I thought, well, this could be, an opportunity, since I'm stuck at home and I have this technology, to try something new. So journalism practice I described has great promise and potential, but it also has paywalls, right? And it also, it's supposed to be about trying to communicate with practitioners, citizens, students, people who don't sit behind a database or have access. So we found a way that for those articles that have appeared in the journal about journalism that we find interesting and we hold a podcast session with, we provide free access for people for about a month, to access those PDFs from the database, from the website, and download them, right? So we've talked to the corporation into giving away some of these pieces, if they appear on the podcast, in a free access way, to try and spread that information. So far, we've had 60 guests from 40 countries. We can talk about some of the issues still surrounding the geographic dispersal and representation. It's still very Western. It's still very global North, even though I don't like that term. In part, and there are lots of reasons we can talk about why. Some of it is, again, the corporatization of scholarship. Sometimes it's the ideological stance of the Westernization of journalism. And simply it's, trying to see if we can get this podcast as a way to reach out to different regions of the world so that we are more open and they might consider publishing their research with us. You can hear it on Apple, Spotify, or online. Here are just some of the examples of things that we've talked about. Recently, we've released an episode about missing voices, the vulnerable in news. There's been podcasts about sexual violence and the Me Too movement and journalism's role in that. Focus on peace journalism will come out at the end of this season. We talked obviously about race, protests, and Donald Trump. Talked about technology and artificial intelligence, social media futures, how to cover police, crime, and terrorism, and also the notion of interactions between journalism and citizenry, digital civicness, and cell phones. So I won't go through all of this, but this is the description of what we say the J Word podcast is. It's asking the question, what is journalism? How can we make it better? And what does better look like? We focus on the meanings of advancing digital technologies, social issues, conditions that journalists need to cover, and we talk about the future of the field. We provide free access to some of these articles as they appear on the podcast. And while the discussions are rooted in research, they are approached to influence practice. So that's the official definition. And here I tried to highlight the different things, but I forgot that was on there. So, but what's the real aim, right? And the real aim for me is to be subversive, right? To undermine some of the power structures, but we just don't put that out there publicly, right? Because it just wouldn't be good for the corporation. It wouldn't, I don't know if my editor would like this way of talking about it. But this is the real reason, is to be subversive. To use this as a platform where we have participants in discussions that are talking about whiteness in particular. Again, an issue within Western society, but whiteness is a global issue. And you know it is when you're in different parts of the countries of the world that are fighting against critical race theory and other things. Black feminisms, other types of perspectives that are getting to some of the points of contestation, that plague us a lot. But it's really to try and unpack from the scholarship that we're publishing and to comment on larger journalistic research and on the trends of journalism to understand not just issues of racisms, but gender, geographic disparities, all the things that I front-loaded the conversation with. We're trying to have these conversations. So you may have 3 articles that we're talking about on the podcast, but the discussion isn't about the intricacies necessarily of every single article. It's about the combinations through kind of a lens of critical theory and cultural studies. I'm trying to undermine some of the corporatized scholarship that's often paid for by the people, right? Through grants, through tax dollars, things that fund universities, things that allow people to do the research by having an employment where they can do the scholarship. And then the universities themselves, a lot of them funded by the people through tax dollars or philanthropies or government grants, where libraries spend that money toward the databases to get past the paywalls, to get for their scholars and students scholarships. So we're trying to say, yeah, you're going to do that. And I know open access, right, which is the last point here, is where scholars can spend money, often very large amounts of money, to have their article made open access, free to anybody who has the internet access to it. They can go download the article and read it. But you have to have grant money for that, or you have to have money in your pocket, or you have to have someone funding. Sometimes the universities will fund it, this open access. So open access itself isn't the savior, but maybe finding different ways throughout time through free access or through these types of public disseminations could be a way to undermine both the corporate structure and this myth that open access is the only way through. So we wanted to make this real. I wanted to make this real by producing something that scholars can consider engagement, something they can put on their CVs and on their resumes, something that they can use as an opportunity for a public dissemination of their scholarship. I mean, I've found, and we'll talk about this, I think, in a minute, so many guests have never publicly talked about their scholarship before this podcast. And so for me, as a host and producer, I have to be patient, right? And help coax them along. I don't edit a lot. I edit ums and uhs, as you can tell. I probably have a lot of those. But, oh, there's one. But gives people an opportunity for affirmation, right? For celebration of their ideas. It's very Marxist maybe, uncapitalized the corporate control of scholarship for these people. Some people didn't even have the money or access to read their own scholarship that had been published in the journal because their universities didn't have the structural financial backing to have access to the database. These are things that I didn't know. I knew some of these things, but some of that stuff I didn't even know until in the really anecdotal moments of conversation in the podcast, which is a real concern. So I can feed this back to the editors, I can feed this back to corporations, and to scholarly institutions and say, we think we have a problem, but it's a little bit more complicated than we think it is. And to create a forum of to critique the dominant scholarship trends and ideologies. And if people are coming on to the podcast, they may have listened to a couple episodes before, but they don't necessarily know, I don't think, that I'm going to try and critique not their work in, specifically, but the ideological pressures that are existing that create their scholarship in their minds, right? And how and why they're approaching certain things certain ways. So why are we still talking about social media in certain ways? Why, when somebody writes a piece of scholarship from India, from Russia, from South America, almost anywhere in South America, we as scholars almost force them to explain intricately the media systems. But if somebody's writing it from the UK or the US or Canada, we don't ask them to do that. But if it's coming from Kenya, we say, tell us all about Kenya, media spheres. That's fine. Context is important. We need to know these things. But we don't ask them to do it if it's coming from, England, right? Because we think we know what that is, because that's fitting into the westernized cultures of scholarship and journalism studies. Again, people, providing evidence for promotion and tenure. This is why it's particularly important for me to include non-white men. White men find their way into the podcast just fine, but non-white men and women to participate in this, because we know that there are inequalities within academic structures just as well as in other parts of societies, and this provides an elevation for people. And it's to obviously build theory and help maybe provide some ideas about practice at its core, right? So what's the reckoning part? How are we actually reckoning? If we go back to Coulson's and Young's kind of idea, well, it's the decolonization aspect, I think. And I know I have about 5 or 10 minutes here, so I'll end so I can hear what you think. But the decolonization of our scholarship and our discussions around scholarship in journalism studies, if there are 10,000 people, right, the same people get cited over and over and over and over again. And in my next job, the last job I'll have before I die, I would like to do a network analysis where I can just show who are the people. And I know some people are starting to do this sort of work because they're noticing the same thing. That it's the same people who are just citing each other and elevating their status within journalism studies. But yet within those people, there isn't a great diversity of ideological thought, right? They all kind of are along the same thing, saying the same stuff, citing each other, not really questioning in different ways, bringing in different ideas globally. I mean, Perry Parks is someone at Michigan State who is writing about if Buddhist approaches to journalism can help solve some of journalistic crises. And I think that, that's really interesting, but why does that have to kind of set over on the periphery? Why can't that, God forbid, become a little bit more mainstreamed to then have a discussion about whether that could work or not? And is to spread, well, let me just say this about knowing names. I've had people come on and constantly, several times, say, this is my name. You can pronounce it in the English way of this. Now, I'm a straight white man from the Midwest of the United States. Until I was probably 16, I didn't start to see or hear people who were different from me. And since then, I've sought that out every day. In Northern England, it's very hard, let me tell you. So again, I'm also thankful for digital technologies. But I try and say, no, wait. You tell me how you would like your name pronounced. And I will take the responsibility of learning to do it. I may not do it 100% well, but just like our moderator this morning checked how do I pronounce my name, and I appreciated that. We were able to have that conversation so that it was accurately pronounced. And I have an expectation as a host and producer of a podcast to represent that person how they want to be represented. And I think that there is another moment where we're like, whoa, what is going on in journalism and journalism studies in particular, right? Where we have people who don't want to communicate or opt out of communicating, in part because people don't know how to say their name, or they choose not to how they choose. It's a willful ignorance, right? I'm choosing to not know how to pronounce your name. And my wife, who I love dearly, is Colombian and just has a much better ear because of the transnational perspectives and lived experiences that she's had, that she spells things phonetically for me. And I try my best. And I think that that's part of that reckoning, is saying, man, I don't know, right? But I need to be humble and I need to do it. And I'm not saying I do everything right, but I think that that's part of that reckoning process. And it's the part of the form and the function of the podcasting sphere, I think, the techniques and the landscape that allows us to hear and pick out some of these aspects of, wait, you couldn't even afford to get your own scholarship that you worked on? Problem. Wait, there's an issue with people not pronouncing your name correctly, and you're going to give up the way that you pronounce your name to fit the model of somebody else? Problem, right? So that's helpful, I think, as an anecdote. The other thing is, a part of reckoning is spreading social capital. As I said, there are names of people who are going to appear on my network analysis, right, who just cite each other. Well, let's have them on the podcast because they've published in the journal. And then let's bring in names that we don't know, people we haven't heard, emerging scholars, right, scholars from other places, so people can decolonize their ways of thinking about journalisms, right, particularly those of us in Western journalism. Not just to say, oh, how are they doing it in Norway? Oh, how are they doing it in Chile? Oh, how are they doing it in some other place? But to say, these are not places to just be observed, for us to learn about them. And this comes from my wife too. Not just to learn about them, but to learn from them. And I think that's brilliant. I think it's a really great idea. So we don't do episodes where it's like, this is how journalism operates in India. This is how journalism operates in England. This is how journalism operates in Portugal. We don't do that. We have themes and ideas where people who are publishing from these different areas talk about those ideas. Certainly they can come back and say, this is how we think it's done in Kenya, but it's about what are these themes and these ideas through a critical cultural lens, and what can we learn from how journalism's done in India? Learn about how it's done from Ireland or someplace else, right? And we try to mask a bit of this activism that I've been talking about as public relations, right? And I learned this when I've since been teaching at universities. If you're going to do something a little bit different, you put students out in front of you. You involve the students. You say, this is good for the students. Look how much they're enjoying it, right? And universities have a hard time kind of ignoring that student experience. Same thing here, right? You say, this is great promotion for the journal, and it is. We can get our citation numbers up, and we are. We can get our impact factor higher, and we are. But it's saying that we're doing this for some PR ideas, but I can also have some activist perspectives to it. It's neutral. This is going back to reckoning. It's neutralizing this notion of neutrality that journalism continues to say, instead of maybe objective, because objectivity continues to be pushed out the door, maybe rightfully so, and certainly complicated and problematized. But it's neutralizing the neutrality. And so I do bring in some of my opinions from scholarly perspectives in the questions that I ask, the way that we interrogate these themes, not necessarily the individual scholars, but the ideas that are surrounding their work. And I find a way of doing that through cultural studies and critical theory, particularly, and again, a Western approach to journalism and journalism studies that is so based in social science, of quantifiable and the things that can be counted and explained through a certain limited lens. Not a bad lens, but one that could supplement or complement different perspectives in the world. And going back to reckoning, again, applying scrutiny, right, to those who might be unscrutable. I made that word up. But it's scrutinizing, wait, why are we as journalists doing such a thing? Why are we covering terrorists in such a way, or alleged terrorists in such a way? Why are we writing about capitalism in such a way? Why are we, and it's scrutinizing in a way that's hopefully moving us in a direction where we can do something about it, whether we maintain how we're operating or we change it in one way or another. But how do we know if this reckoning will work? How do we know if this podcast will work? Well, it's like I go on my Google Scholar to see how many people cite me. Yes, we look at metrics, right? But it has to be more than metrics, right? We have to go more than just readership. And I appreciated the fascinating insights about downloads and listeners in India and its ranking. Yes, absolutely. It can be within metrics, right? But how we kind of understand the impact of a podcast, I don't know that even podcast studies have a really great way of understanding how to do that. It is such a personal, intimate, again, sort of perspective on how a person interacts with a podcast. When we were doing some types of community journalism about sea level rise in Miami, we could measure by hits, spread, penetration, all those different things in a digital realm. But it wasn't until I heard students come back and say, oh yeah, we talk about sea level rise and journalism and stuff at the kitchen table every night. Wow, that's a really interesting way to look at how that movement was going beyond media, going beyond the classroom and going to the kitchen table where people were actually engaging with some of these ideas. How do we capture that and measure that? We measure, I think, by the rigor of the podcast discussion, but that's subjective. I'd really love to see collaboration between scholars who join together on a podcast. You take a really famous person's name that is the spreading of social capital because people are there to listen to that person, but they're also listening to somebody they haven't heard. Could they collaborate and influence each other? And then it goes back to the question of, will we ever know? And how do we know when we know? And until then, I think we just have to keep on moving until we hear that it's not working. And it's pretty clear to hear when it's not working, right? So here's some references I don't expect you to look at, and I can share those with you. I can share the podcast when we're done, but I think I might have actually hit time. So I'd love to hear comments and questions from others. I'll stop sharing this so that we can see each other a little bit better. But there you go. That's what I had.
Thank you so much. I think one line, very, very strong, powerful statement that came from Professor Gushi's session is represent them how they want to be represented. Very, very powerful. This session opened a lot of epistemological and ontological questions, because I think that's my key takeaway from this session. And yes, we do talk a lot about how communication studies, journalistic studies is gendered, it is male, there's inherent whiteness, gendering, the geographical disparities, all these points that you brought in your presentation is something that needs to be a pertinent discussion even in our zone. We need to consciously talk about diversity even over here. Especially during the COVID, what happened was a lot of women actually exited the workforce and nobody really cared, because you had daycares which were closed down. So unless you were privileged, you couldn't work. So that's another very interesting takeaway for us. And yes, a lot of takeaways actually, right from uncapitalizing the corporate control of scholarship, creating a platform for critique of dominant scholarship. You were talking about the trends, the ideologies, the non-white discourses here in India. We definitely need to talk about diversity in teaching and learning as a policy decision, not just as a discussion and just throw it out of the window, but as a policy. We talk a lot about it, but it doesn't actually end up in policy decision making. And yes, I really loved the concept of reckoning, about coming to term with unfinished business, and that was very, very fascinating for me. It's an important zone of discussion. Actually, when you were talking about podcasting as a power tool, how it has a collaborative potential and application, and the ontologies, how you can connect it with everyday lives and everyday discourses. Isn't that not very pertinent for us, right? The taken for granted everyday lives. something very, very pivotal for us. And
Mhm.
I think even for my students over here and for all the students in Parishiraja College, the corporatization, ideological undertones, activism and PR, these are pivotal themes they also deal with. So
Mhm.
these are pivotal themes that we should perhaps, deal with. We could probably think of something like a collaborative scholarship. Um, Another very, very important point I want to talk about here is I really loved how you were talking about how discussions are rooted in research. I also believe very strongly that the converging point is in the world of practice. So uh, the deliberations should not stop there, but we should see some kind of an outcome. And you were talking about how to make it real,
Mhm.
produce something for engagement and public dissemination of scholarship. I think this is the biggest point for all of us over here. I think most of us who have joined here are from the southern part of India. The dissemination of public scholarship. As an academic community, I definitely feel we need to pave a path to talk about it, to facilitate public scholarship. It is still a very, very privileged space. We are not talking about spreading of social capital. We are not talking enough about it. Yes, we have made huge progress over here in decolonizing literature,
Mhm.
decolonizing various sets of studies from various sets of disciplines, yes. And also another point about emerging scholars, how they need space. I see this mindset about, oh, this particular person has been cited a zillion times, so let me go with their work. So, where do we give the space for emerging scholars who's not been cited even once? And especially in social sciences, politics is huge. So, emerging scholars need space, of mind space.
Yeah.
And Professor Rishi, you raised such pertinent points, such important points. And finally, I think the closure of it when you were talking about the impact of a podcast really struck a chord here because, yes, how do we capture and how do we measure it? It's still something, although we are quite familiar with the platform right now because of the large user base, we're still kind of, negotiating about how do we actually measure it? How do we talk about it. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We thoroughly enjoyed, and I think there are a few questions in the chat box for you. Okay. I'm so sorry. They are actually that's a feedback link in the chat box. So please, those of you here, if you can just access the link, it would be great. And any questions?
Yes, I have question.
Sure.
Yeah, Dr. Robert, you give me a very fantastic speech. I'm so happy. This is Mo Ganesan from Chennai. I am Tamil Nadu Open University journalism scholar. I am a
Okay.
journalist also, 20 years experience. Do you believe that, Mr. Robert, nowadays multimedia has developed it's make global as a village?
Hmm.
Do you believe podcasting dominate in future?
Well, it came and went once, didn't it? It kind of like the electronic newsletter. It was a big thing, and then it went away, and then it came back again. Um, I think it's going to be a medium that is so reliant on mobility, right? And the disposable time that people may or may not have as they're mobile and moving. I think it's hard because if you're a single parent or if you have caring responsibilities and you're taking somebody to the hospital, you don't get to just sit on the bus and listen to the podcast because you're taking care of the people around you. Um, but I think that it's an opportunity where if we have a society that can find and make disposable time, maybe it's when you're cleaning, maybe it's when you're moving about again, or you're waiting for a meeting to start, or you're waiting for your shift at work or something. Uh, if it can be used in that way, so like for instance, our podcast is too long for that. Our podcast is 50 minutes, 45 minutes, right? So I obviously have in my mind the idea of who the audience might be, that they actually have 50 minutes. Um, or so maybe it's the 20-minute podcasts that are going to be more helpful for people. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, what I am thinking that in Chennai, Storytel, that kind of clubhouse, that kind of podcasting is familiar now. When that in Chennai, lot of FM is there, they broadcast many advertisement. They give, they give very little level information. Then they give lot of gossip and cinema news only. When I will compare the before 20 years or 30 years before, it's advertisements is very low, information is very high. The people, everybody, they trust that radio kind of. But nowadays, the multimedia is developing. Mojo is mobile journalism is developing. It's a lot of fake news. Lot of fake news, fake voices. I think nowadays in Chennai or in Tamil Nadu, they want only for the story, important stories and important familiar authors' stories. They listen only that kind of what I'm saying that I forgot that what I'm saying. That only they listen. I think last book festival in Chennai, the Storytel, but they have one separate stall. That's very famous that time also. Yeah, this kind of going here. So in future, say everything mobiles have a radio, TV, calendar, watch. Everything is we are in hand. Public also now we are reporter, yes, a journalist, a photojournalist, video journalist, blah blah blah. It's right news or wrong news. They don't know. If they impressed, they catch it. They will publish it.
Well, I saw one of the questions in the comments was about are we going to have newspapers in the future, right? I think it's pretty clear we're not going to have newspapers in the future. I mean, one of the projects I'm supposed to be working on is a futurology of journalism. So applying future studies and scenarios as to what journalism might look like. And I think it's going that way. But what might really happen is in the future, whatever that means, right? So relative, maybe the print component becomes special again, right? And so and we can see that in the notion of zines, right? Which are these little comics or little pieces of writing, sometimes handmade. They're little magazines, right? And sometimes they're sold in vending machines. Sometimes they're handed out. Sometimes they're just but they have a particular purpose again. And those come and go. And so what we tried to do, and again in Miami, was we made a zine. And then there was a moment of trying to, well, how do we use AR, augmented reality, to make the zine digital again? And it's just kind of like, wait a second, right? Where there's this constant push to want to go in one direction. And so you have a zine that in of itself is a beautiful piece of handmade work that's really meaningful and immersive in its own way. But now we have to apply digital technology to it. So it's that constant battle. But thanks I liked hearing that input. Thank you.
There's one more question in the chat box, which says from Shyam Swaroop. Podcast listeners in India surged during the pandemic. What is the trend in other countries?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing, and I'm sorry, I don't have the statistics in my head, but yes, we're seeing, and that's one of my things is that it seems to be one of those approaches that are so reliant upon lifestyle, right? Like the newspaper was popular not just because it was the only thing technologically. I mean, we could have had telegraphs doing something, right? We could have found other ways, but the newspaper as a form, as a tactile object, worked so well because you could, and this goes back to oftentimes misinterpretations of Habermas, but in the public sphere, but where you had a newspaper set around a table in a coffee shop. If you look at the image of political cartoons, for instance, right, the political cartoon emerged not because it was a new fun form, partially, but also because of literacy rates, right? It was a way to have people discuss politics, events, ideas of the day through an image, a cartoon, where they could say, oh, this is the fat cat, sort of like, mayor of the city in control. Look at how he's got everything and the rest of us have nothing, right? That's a pretty easy thing to depict in an editorial cartoon. And so that fit around what the needs, the culture, the society, of the mobility of the time was. And so podcasting, like other aspects of media and communication, must be connected to dominant interpretations of lifestyle. But again, I have great privilege, right? So that 50 minutes of sitting down and recording something and putting it out there for 50 minutes makes sense to me. And it makes sense ideologically to me because of the power structure that I want to reinforce, i.e. the privilege that I have, that other people have 50 minutes, right? Other people must have 50 minutes to sit down and listen to some people just talking, right? And so these mediums are ripe with inequalities in how we produce them as much as how we either disseminate or don't disseminate them. So I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, across the globe, we've seen much more movement toward podcasts, but that's partially because people have been stuck at home, forced to be at home, sick, or something else. So that's but it's an interesting way to look at how one medium might be more successful than another.
Robert, I point out one point here. When the national disaster and natural disaster came, that time the radios, that podcasting, very powerful. They give rightful information in people. So I want to point out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, good. Awesome. Any other? I know our time might be coming to an end, but I love comments and questions if there's anything else you think is helpful.
Please feel free to unmute and talk. Any other questions? Any other comments? Any other observations?
Now, I'll put my email address in here. People are free to contact me here or on Twitter or anything else. I'm trying to remember what my email address is. But I'm happy to find time to chat with people if they find time and they want to talk more.
Meanwhile, there's one more question in the chat box. Niche podcasting is also picking up in India, where they are catering for specific listener groups. It's a comment by Shyam Swaroop.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I talked about, or kind of alluded to in the beginning, that there's and I'm not saying that this person is talking about divisive topics by any means, but it is that the platform is providing people to have conversations that are, so we could go from the flat earth movement of people finding this as a way to talk about, that the earth is flat, right? We could have people go and talk about how transgendered individuals have really great stories to share about celebrating identity amongst the struggles that exist, and that can be affirmative to people. We could have very specific niche audiences, and that's one of those things that might be successful about the forum. Again, I know, looking at our download numbers, we're never going to have huge download numbers, right? Because the intention isn't to get 7,000 people to listen to it every single episode, right? That's just not what we're about, right? Certainly there are ones that are extremely successful in that way, but I think there's also some power in the agency, right? The ability to act otherwise in order to evoke social change, right? That agency that's inherent. Some people call it power, right? Some people will say that the podcast empowers people, but you can't empower somebody, right? Because I don't have the ability to do that. Power isn't a commodity that can be bought and sold and traded and had and lost, right? Power is from a critical and cultural perspective, right, is innate. It's in every single person. And what we need to do is encourage people to enact their agency. That doesn't mean that the consequences are the same for everybody if they choose to enact their agency, right? But I think the podcasting platform might be one of those aspects because, where people could enact their agency. And I mean, certainly there's societies where there'll be consequences for that. I mean, absolutely, right? And there are going to be positions where there are going to be consequences for that. But there might be ways to mask voices, host it on a server someplace else, right? I mean, there's a great documentary that's old now, but called, I think it's called Burma VJ, Burma Video Journalist. And it's a documentary that writes about how people physically smuggled out of Burma a video that they created to then be broadcast about Burma outside of Burma at the time that Burma was Burma, right? And there was that movement of how people were trying to advocate for social change, right? Podcasting, you probably need to smuggle out some ideas on somebody else's VPN someplace else, right? So there could be some ways, but I think this is a very niche aspect. But somebody also put in the comment about nice voices, right? I don't have the voice for radio. Why the hell am I doing this? I don't have the voice for radio, right? And I sure don't have the physical presence for TV, right? But it's about those ideas and trying to get people to get past the vanity of things and to some of those ideas.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bushi. And yes, access, agency, and impact of the podcast. I'm going to take that with me. Thank you very much for this. Thank you, everyone who has tuned in, listened in with your wonderful comments and questions. Thanks a lot. So I would hand it over back to Professor Jobin. Dr. Jobin.